James Madison once famously said that in the Virginia Report of 1800, 1799 and 1800, that some things legislatively follow because a power is granted or a power is withheld. And in the instance that Madison was talking about, he was referring to his arguments against the alien part of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And he said that, hey, if we're not prevented from exercising the power over alien friends of admitting them, then if you have the power to admit them, well, then certainly, or if Congress is telling us that we have the power to expel them, well, then that would mean concurrently that we have the power to admit them. So if the power to admit, if Congress has the power to admit a state into the Union, then Congress has the power to deny admission of a state into the Union. And we know that Utah was denied 3 times from 1860, from the late 1850s to the early 1890s. And I believe on the 4th or the 5th time, they finally had altered their constitution, and Congress said yes. That means that the admission into the Union is not compulsory. Just because you happen to be located in the landmass known as Northern America. Fertile food for thought, yes. Chris Ferrara, who is now on the Dude Maker Skype line.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, brother. How are you?
Okay. I enjoyed the analysis, but there's a problem with it, if I may beg to differ.
Well, that's why I did it while you were on, because you're the attorney.
Okay. Well, we're dealing with what is essentially a manifestation of Locke's compact theory. Mm-hmm. The Constitution is a social compact entered into by the various states. And according to Locke's compact theory, once you expressly consent to a social compact and enter therein, the expression of consent is irrevocable. The only escape at that point is revolution. And that is exactly what we have seen in American history with the Civil War. There was an express consent. Consent was irrevocable. Unless you can come up with a breach of the compact justifying the revolutionary warrant, you're stuck with it. And that is why the Constitution itself, in Article 1, Section 10, for example, has a compacts clause, which forbids the states to enter into compacts with each other. And the document as a whole, the United States Constitution, is a systematic surrender of sovereign rights on the part of the states that seek admittance or that are admitted to the Union with the consent of Congress. They give up the right to coin money, regulate commerce, wage war. They have the right to impair contracts. The grant of powers is so extensive that it is quite inconsistent with the survival of the states as separate sovereign entities. So that is the problem we have. The Constitution was full of time bombs in that respect. Anyone who entered into this as a resident of a colony that became a state or a new state admitted into the Union, such as Texas, with the idea that they could secede voluntarily was deluded. It simply isn't in the document. That's the problem we have. I would love to have a right of secession at will on the part of any state. Let's hope California exercises that right. Let's see what happens with California. But the fact of the matter is that when you're dealing with social compact theory, and this is a manifestation of it, the premier historical manifestation of it, you're dealing with a consent that is irrevocable. That's the problem.
Now, there's nothing in the okay.
Unless you have grounds for revolution.
Yeah, no, I know, I understand that, but is there any in Liberty, the guy that failed? Is there anything in the record of the when the Declaration was being written and then ratified, when the Articles of Confederation were being written and then ratified? Certainly, in the if you were to word search inside the Virginia Ratification Convention, I don't think that you find anything about that social compact theory. I think one of the guys mentions Locke, because I know I searched for it before, But there's no real mention of that. So how can something be binding when it really wasn't agreed to? How do you lawyers say, ex parte or?
Well, the way you would approach that is to talk about what Justice Scalia called the background political philosophy of the age. Granted, there's no express citation to Locke's treatises on government, but that was the theory at work. It's everywhere in the documents, everywhere in the public pronouncements of the colonial radicals, that they have a right, under the social compact theory, to revoke a compact that has been breached by the ruler, have a revolution, and enter into a new compact. And when you enter into that compact, for example, with the Articles of the Confederation, it's perpetual. The Articles of the Confederation were deemed to be a perpetual union of the states. And how do you get out of that union? Well, you just don't walk away. If you could just walk away and voluntarily secede by simply declaring that you've had enough of it and you'll take your leave now, thank you very much, we would have seen such declarations from the southern states that did publish declarations setting forth the reasons for seceding from the Union. None of them invoked a voluntary departure clause in the Constitution because it isn't there.
It isn't there.
Or a theory of voluntary departure. In fact, all of them, the ones that published declarations, said the same thing. You breached the compact, federal government. You failed to exercise your power in our benefit by enforcing the interstate rendition of slaves. Therefore, because of this breach of compact, which threatens our property rights, and Texas also added the failure of the federal government to protect us from banditry, you have breached your obligation to us, and we leave the compact. Nowhere was any talk of Southern rebellion against federal tyranny. It was the failure of the federal government to act. There's no declaration that the South is seceding to preserve chivalry, mint juleps, or Southern rights.
So, okay, so now I've heard the counter to this argument, and the counter to this argument, and Kevin Gutzman, author of Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, and then James Madison, Making of the American, and now Thomas Jefferson, Revolutionary. Kevin says because the perpetual union clause has come up, and your former collaborator Tom Woods has also written about this, that 1781 perpetual union does not mean perpetual in the sense that we make it perpetual. What that means is that it can continue. In other words, you don't have to go back and re-ratify the Articles of Confederation once it's been ratified. It stays in effect until such time as you go like, I'm done. That's what I've heard.
Well, but in a sense, that's true. But in another sense, it supports my claim. In other words, they've created this compact, and by its nature, it's perpetual. Nothing further has to be done. So then the question is, okay, we have this perpetual compact. Nothing further needs to be done. We don't have to renew it annually like a membership in a club. Now, what if I want to get out of it? That's the key. The key is what happens when I want to leave? Well, perhaps the result would have been different under the Confederacy. But once the states got together and met in that closed-door session in Philadelphia, the 55 delegates, and conducted a veritable coup d'etat.
Boy, howdy.
Even Murray Rothbard calls the meeting in Philadelphia a power grab. They effectively ceded key attributes of sovereignty to the central government. And so then the question then arose within a generation, well, what if we want out? The Constitution doesn't provide for an at-will exit from the Union. It's that simple. It's not in the document. So then a debate arose as to whether the secession was at will or whether there had to be grounds for secession. And if so, would the grounds have to constitute also grounds for revolution? And so the best you can say is they entered into an ambiguous relationship without clarifying the right of secession. Sort of like the documents of Vatican II in the Catholic Church, laden with ambiguous phrases whose manifestations were felt later on when it came time to apply them to a practical situation. In the case of the United States, it was, we want out of the Union. And Lincoln said, well, you can't get out of the Union unless, and Lincoln said this himself explicitly, unless you have grounds for revolution. You can always revolt. That's the Protestant idea in operation. You've breached my compact with you. I now declare grounds for revolution, and I revolt. But again, I hearken back to the original source documents the declarations of secession by the southern states. None of them said, oh, this was just a voluntary union. We can leave whenever we want. If they had thought that, if the leadership of the southern states had thought that, they simply would have recited this right. Instead, they contrived arguments for breach of compact. You need a breach of compact to justify exiting the compact. Otherwise, you're stuck with it. And the only exit from the compact when it is breached is the same exit they took in 1776 when the king breached his compact. Revolution.
So we have a breach of compact today.
Well, I think more than adequate grounds exist to declare the government illegitimate and to rebel against its ordinances. But then you run into another problem, which is in Catholic teaching, just war theory. You can't take up arms against a government that will destroy you and your family and your friends and your neighbors with its awesome and invincible firepower.
True.
It's a pointless exercise.
True.
You might make an argument for civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is indicated on many fronts now. There's even a duty to engage in civil disobedience as to certain pieces of immoral and unjust legislation. But the idea that we can just take up arms is preposterous. First of all, it violates Catholic just war teaching because there's no likelihood of success. So what it amounts to basically is an unjust war, and people would be sacrificed to the war unjustly, and the outcome would be immoral. But secondly, what if you did secede? Okay, so California secedes from the Union. Well, what do we get? We get Sodom and Gomorrah on the West Coast. So it's not a moral solution to the problem. You're going to be stuck with the same framework, this endless framework, this endlessly applied framework of creating social compacts, exiting the compacts through revolution, creating another social compact based upon the same principle of majoritarian rule, which is morally standardless. That's why gimmicks like nullification don't work. What are you going to nullify? Vermont would nullify any law restricting abortion. Maybe Texas would nullify any law authorizing abortion.
Right.
But because it's morally standardless, there's no guidance for the outcome of these political activities. So all you're saying with nullification is let the people decide whether to nullify a particular law. Where's the moral standard? There is none. We're in the same boat we've been for the last 250 years. We have a democratic regime which, in terms of its technical elements, could be serviceable, but we don't have the underlying moral principles to guide political life. And this is what Orestes Brownson was talking about when he wrote his famous essay, Catholicism is Necessary to Sustain Popular Liberty. You can't resist the downward trend of democracy morally and spiritually with a religion that is itself democratic.
Right.
It's to listen to what the majority want. Well, so the ultimate solution to the whole political and civilizational crisis has to be a return to its religious foundations in what was known as Christendom. How is that going to happen today? It isn't going to happen.
It's not going to happen today. Now, what if it happens?
Unless there's well, it will eventually happen, but it's probably going to happen with a civilizational reboot. And you know what that means? It means a world war or some kind of catastrophe.
Well, these maniacs are going to get us in a world war. And
Sure.
they're trying to do it right now. Chris Ferrara is my guest on the Skype Maker Hotline. He is the author of, and we have these books in the Founders Trading Post at mikechurch.com. You can read all about what he's talking about here. And Liberty, the book is Liberty, the God That Failed, and signed and dated by Chris in the Founders Trading Post. We also have the crisis of novelty in the Catholic Church. What's the main title of that? I always get it wrong.
Oh, The Great Facade.
Great Facade, the crisis of novelty in the Catholic Church, signed and autographed in hardback.
Close enough.
Yeah, got it. By Chris. We talk about this, and we're going to talk about it today. Again, about the need for the restoration of the Christian order, or more specifically put, when the word Christian was universal. It's not, as Michael Voris pointed out in a video that I sent you, it's not universal any longer. It can mean it can mean almost anything that you want it to mean. As a matter of fact, you are encouraged to say, well, Mitter Ferrara, please, that's not the kind of Christianity I practice, just because you and your Pope and your funny hat. Of course, there's a great debate going on whether of what he is actually practicing these days as well. But I want to go back to the Second Vatican Council and start just with you. And then we're going to talk to Sandy in Kentucky. But let's go from this point of view that you just said. You got to restore Christendom. You have to restore the correct order, which this show has dedicated itself to promoting and educating and talking about and to getting people excited about, because it is possible. What if, now, we're also going to talk about Rod Dreher's Benedict option, which I think is a recipe for disaster. But what if, in small pockets, small areas, and I think this is already happening, there is a return to order, as John Horvat calls for, and there is a restoration of the kingship of Christ and the church as its head and enforcement mechanism. And it may not be that this is legally done, but it has been pragmatically done. Some places, like in the area around the Clear Creek Abbey in eastern Oklahoma, western Arkansas, in the area around Brother Andre Marie's St. Benedict Institute in Richmond, New Hampshire. I'm sure there are other places that I don't know about where this has already begun, where there are areas, pockets of resistance of people. Now, it's not. I don't want to say that they've gone Amish and that they've just cloistered themselves in the world, but enough people have congregated around these areas to where it would be recognizable. And I can tell you that in Richmond, New Hampshire, it is recognizable, and I understand that it is in that place in Oklahoma as well. It is recognizable that, there's something that's going on in that area there, and it's not modern-day America, and we don't want anything to do with it because we're secular hedonist pagans. So we're not going to go move. We're not going to consider moving to that place. So this has already, I think, begun. What say you?
Well, of course it's begun. Catholics I know are everywhere across the country set up enclaves of traditional Catholicism within which they can live their lives as Catholics. It's still possible in this country. And there's no place in the world you or I would rather live. America remains the land of opportunity, not only for economic advancement, but for the protection of certain religious interests, although those days seem to be coming to a close. At least now with this administration, we bought ourselves some time. But with the transgender agenda and the militant homosexual agenda and the ever-increasing power of the federal government, we're under threat. We're under threat in this country, and we're going to follow suit, as Canada has done, with hate crimes legislation, at least at the local level and the state level. So the tentacles of persecution are reaching out toward us, but it's still possible to set up these little enclaves. It's still possible to live your life, and even to express opinions like the ones we're expressing now on the internet. So the end is not here yet. So there's hope in that respect, that in groups of Catholics, groups of serious Christians can create communities within which they can live their lives according to authentic Christian teaching.
Sure.
That can be done, sure.
844-527-8723 is our telephone number if you'd like to be on the program. Just going to talk to Sandy in Kentucky. Sandy, you're on with Chris Ferrara here on the Mike Church Show on the Crusade Channel, King Size Truth from Radio Size Speakers. How you doing?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you. I do believe that there is a breach of compact or contract, and that is in the power that was given by the states to the Congress to coin gold or silver as our money. And it was changed not by an amendment to the Constitution, but by an act that the Congress made, and they had not the authority to give this power away that the states agreed to.
Well, I would have no trouble drafting up a very lengthy indictment of the federal government for its numerous breaches of the Lockean Social Compact. I could do that within about 2 hours and present it to you. Problem is what you do with the document. Secession is going to involve war. There's no way around that. The only way out of the compact is through the breach of compact, which requires revolutionary enforcement. You have to say you've breached your agreement with us. We now rebel against your authority. That's how we got the United States of America in the first place,
right.
Over breach of compact theory.
That's right. Well, Sandy, I mean, that's the point that you made is valid, and you're not the only one that's made that point. And that kind of gives us an idea of the usefulness of the point, and that is that the money has been rendered illegitimate. Sandy, I don't know if you heard, but when David Simpson had a guest on the show, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember his name now, Sanders, Franklin Sanders. Did you hear when David had Franklin Sanders on and they talked about this?
I think so, yes.
Well, now, Chris, you'll find this innovative. So Sanders was taken to court to pay because he didn't pay a tax bill, and when he finally got in front of the judge, I think it was a state tax bill or something to that effect. When he finally got in front of the judge, the judge said, Mr. Sanders, it's been demonstrated that you have the resources to pay the tax bill. So if you're not going to pay the tax bill, then I'm going to sentence you. We're going to throw the book at you. And Sanders said, Your Honor, I can't pay the tax bill, and you can't make me pay it. And the judge was stupefied. He didn't know what to say. He goes, under what grounds can you not pay the tax bill? And Sanders' response was the clause in the Constitution about not paying any bill or debt except in silver or gold coin. And he said, I want to pay it in gold coin. I took the gold coin to the to the tax office, and they wouldn't take it.
That's because the Federal Reserve doesn't deal in money. It only deals in credit.
That's right. So it was a novel way. Sandy, thank you, my dear, for listening.
So what happened in that case?
And always, and thanks for the call. It's always great to hear.
You.
You're very welcome. 844-527-8723. He threw him in jail. He told him you got to pay the paper currency, and he said I can't. That's against the law. And he said and he told the judge you can't make me. And the judge said something to the effect, you can't tell me how the law is going to work. And he ruled against him. So Sanders Franklin went to jail. He did the jail time rather than pay. But the point was made. No, it was a Pyrrhic victory indeed. But it's a valid point. And as you said, look, we can draft up all manner of complaints against the federales for having not done this, from breaching this and that and the other. I'm curious as though, why do you say that it has to end in war? That would require, are members of Congress actually going to vote to sic the Luftwaffe, the American Luftwaffe, and bomb Kentucky back into submission?
Well, that's a very good question. Let's assume California declares that it secedes from the Union. I'd have to think about that. Would Congress let California go? Probably, because California is a liberal state. Yeah. So, I could see a scenario in which California votes to secede, and the federal government says, well, I guess there's not much we can do about that. California is now the Republic of California. It's the way it says on the California flag. Well, let's assume 10 states banded together, as the Confederacy did, and say 10 modern-day states band together and declared their secession from the Union to form a new confederation. I can't imagine that the federal government in D.C. would tolerate that maneuver. So, it's hypothetical. I don't know, but if you declare you're seceding from the Union and you're in the middle of the country, you're landlocked. How are you going to survive? That's another consideration.
Yeah, well,
it's logistically impossible now because of the tight integration of all of the states with the transportation network, the power grid, and so forth.
Oh, you think that wasn't by will to, as Professor Livingston calls it, a force of will to power?
Yeah, but let's consider another alternative. How about an individual secession on a mass basis through passive non-cooperation?
Charles Murray.
Yeah, well, let's assume 50 million Americans just said, we've had it. We're not filing tax returns anymore.
I'm in.
What would the federal government do? And arrest 50 million people. That might be more effective. I mean, ultimately, the whole regime does depend upon popular consent. And the only reason it stays in power is that popular consent remains.
Well, the popular consent
Despite
remains.
all of the complaining that conservatives and the liberals do from their perspectives on the state of affairs in D.C., there's a fundamental level of popular consent, acquiescence in the continuation of this regime. Mere passive non-cooperation would bring it to an end. If nobody listened to its commands anymore, nobody filed tax returns any longer, nobody obeyed its regulations any longer, they couldn't just make an example of a couple of people, because there'd be millions and millions defying its ordinances.
Well, and then
People aren't willing to do that.
Well, and here's why.
Because they're quite comfortable enough as it is.
Well, they're comfortable. They've got Olive Garden, and they are Olive Gardenians. They have Regal Cinema, and they're Regal Cinemites. And they have all the modern contrivances of wealth.
And the circuses, what's the problem?
Bread and circuses, that's exactly right. Then they also have Fox News out there telling them that all is well because Republicans are in control and we're the good kids and we're all going to have hot dogs and chili this evening. And look, there's nothing wrong. We're in New York City. New York City? Yeah, we're in New York City. Look at how happy. Look at how beautiful the women are dressed in their uniforms every day. The Fox News female uniform. You want to talk about a lawsuit just screaming out to happen. Let me see if I understand this. I have to wear a single colored dress, sleeveless dress, cut above the knee every day, and I must stand on camera for hours on end in this getup here. Talk about humiliating. You would think it would be, if women had any modesty left, you'd think it would be humiliating, but apparently paycheck of $600,000 a year will make you forget about all that humiliation. Chris, it's the Mike Church Show here on the Crusade Channel, King Size Truth from Radio Size Speakers. I want to segue into another topic. Can you hang for another segment?
Sure.
Back to Chris Ferrara, author of Liberty, the God That Failed, copies of the book that we have in the Founders Trading Post, signed by Chris and dated Liberty at, I said Liberty Classroom, Liberty, the God That Failed. Also, his other book, The Great Facade, the failure or the crisis of novelty in the Catholic Church. Okay, Chris, sanctifying the temporal sphere. What does that mean?
Well, it means living according to the teachings of the church, and it's basically a simple prescription. Obey the 10 Commandments. Marry a wife for life, bring lives into the world, raise them up in Christian virtue, follow God's owner's manual, and everything else will sort itself out. The political problem, the civilizational crisis is ultimately a crisis of individual loss of faith. We're experiencing right now what John Paul II called silent apostasy in the once Christian world. People live for today. They live for the mall. They live for the game. Too many of us do, and they don't live for eternity. We're destined for eternity. We have to live accordingly. And if we do that, if we open ourselves to life, if we follow the commandments, society will organize itself in what St. Augustine called the tranquility of order. Tranquility of order is more than just the external absence of violence or civil disturbance. It's an interior disposition of the soul, which brings peace to the individual and to the family, and from the family to the state, because the family is the basic cell of society. If the family is dysfunctional because people aren't living according to the law of the gospel, which was the law of the land for more than 1,000 years in Western civilization, then the family disintegrates. And if the family disintegrates, the social order disintegrates. So it begins with the individual entering into the family relationship by marrying for life and obeying the law of the gospel in the context of married life. It's not happening in this country any longer. The institution of marriage is under attack, and even those who still bother getting married aren't really following our Lord's prescription for the married state. Now, the basic prescription for the married state is Number one, it's for life. And number two, it's for the purpose of bringing souls into the world to fill up the number of the elect.
Now, when you say bringing souls in the world, you mean you mean babies, and of course, bringing souls in the world requires a marital act. And what's currently being promoted as fashionable and what cool people should do is to consider, if not adopt homosexuality. And if that's not your cup of tea, well, just go ahead and reject the fact that you're a man or a woman and go ahead and change your sex. That's a rejection of the natural order, isn't it?
Well, that's the final consequence of throwing off the authority of the gospel, as explained and defended for century after century by the Catholic Church. But let's bring it down to concrete examples. Let's take one example. One example. Paul VI predicted this, by the way. Contraception. Once you introduce contraception into the marital relationship, you've destroyed the family, whether you know it or not. Because you've stopped up the wellspring of life, you've turned the sexual act into one primarily for the purpose of giving pleasure rather than bringing a soul, an immortal soul, into the world. Mm-hmm. And once you've debased the marital relation, on what ground do you stand to say that other forms of sexual relations are not legitimate? After all, you're doing your thing as a married couple simply for pleasure. That's why you're taking pills or using other methods to avoid conception. You just want the pleasure of the act.
Sure.
Well, why can't I have the pleasure of the act? I don't do it the way you do it, but I want to do it my way, the equally infertile way. But it's my infertile way. I prefer it this way. So let's assume people stop contracepting. Just take one step. Everyone who claims to be a Christian today, the tens of millions of you who are practicing contraception, stop. Don't contracept any longer. Within a generation, there'll be so many Christians running around, we'd never lose another election.
Well, I have a friend that says that inside the sects, S-E-C-T-S, of the Catholic Church today, that if you attend a traditional Latin Mass service and you go regularly, one of the things you'll notice is that the people that go never miss. That's one. And or rarely miss. And number two, if they are young and they are a married couple, that over the course of years they fill entire pews up on their own. And that it ought to then be obvious, and if you go see their counterparts in the new ordinary, or what a friend of mine expressed to me as, Mike, you need to stop, because I make the announcements at our church of St. Jane, and he said, Mike, you need to stop calling the Latin Mass the extraordinary rite. It's not extraordinary. The Novus Ordo is extraordinary. They're the ones that are in extraordinary time. The one you're announcing for is the Mass. But having said that, we'll outbreed them. Your traditionalists will outpopulate those that are either practicing flights of fancy or contracepting and doing all the things that the modern church says, kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, says that they can do. So right. The future is the old, is the right. We shouldn't even call it the old right. We should just call it the right. And it's an interesting, it's an interesting dynamic that is developing there, and it shows no signs of abating. I know this because I'm in one of those societies, and I could see it with my own two eyes. That congregation is expanding simply by virtue of the fact that there are kids being born. Now, having said all that, let's go on. You said get another concrete example. Let's give another concrete example of what we're talking about here. Rod Dreher is selling tens of thousands of books called under the title of the Benedict option. And of course, he takes this from Saint Benedict, Nurcia. And what St. Benedict did, which basically was to create the Christian civilized life. From the monastic life came the non-monastic civilizations. We take it for granted that we have a civilization today, and that we can pine away, Chris, for a return to when there was a morality that was practiced, it was known, and it wasn't contravened. Well, people don't ever stop to think, okay, well, where did that come from? That wasn't just something that was organic. That actually that was created by men like St. Benedict. Certainly he had a hand in it. And then it was defended from attack from within and without, from attack by Satan and demons and sin, an attack from barbarians and Muslims and heretics. But it was always defended and it always triumphed. It always somehow managed to keep propagating itself until the ultimate rebellion and the ultimate revolution began to topple the order. And that leaves us where we are today, which is with a continuing severing of ties from, in some would describe it as ecumenism, some say it's denominationalism, whatever you wish to call it. We continue to break further and further and further apart. What Dreher is encouraging people to do is to continue the breakup, isn't he?
Exactly. Man, and he contributed to himself. He left the Catholic Church. He abandoned the one true church. Now he's in an Eastern Orthodox. I mean, a physician healed thyself. If you want the true Benedict option, the Benedictine option is the Catholic option. It was the church through the monasteries that restored the entire Christian world following the barbarian invasions. The power of the church to renew the face of the earth is obvious if you study history. It's happened before and it can happen again. Because the church is a supernatural institution, by which I mean the Catholic Church. The supernatural effects of grace mediated to men through the institution of the Catholic Church and the seven sacraments have immense, irresistible power to remake civilization. That is the vehicle for social restoration, not these ad hoc contrivances, these ultimately Nietzschean programs of devising your own orthodoxy and forging out into the wilderness to form your faith community. There's only one faith community that God established. He established it in the Catholic Church to make disciples of all nations. Dreher has left that church. So he's about the last one you want to consult for advice on the restoration. The only way back to the reconstruction of Christian social order is through the doors of the church that introduced that order to the entire world, the Catholic Church.
Now, yesterday, it's kind of just another modern event here. Yesterday was, and I don't know how these things get started, but somebody started it, and I saw it on Twitter, Muslim Women's Day. Muslim Women's Day was the hashtag. Oh, there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tweets. And the usual female suspects were all out there. Well, Muslim women are done this and that, and they need to be given the right to do to express the right to experience liberty. In other words, they need to be Muslim women need to be able to do what American women and what English women and what Portuguese women do, which is become lesbians, become bisexuals, change their sex, have inconsequential premarital sex and conceive babies, kill the babies through the act of abortion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Practice all manner of immodesty, all manner of sinful dress. And why is it sinful? Because men are staring at your legs, hoping that you make the wrong move, ladies and daughters. And if you make the wrong move, they get a free shot. They get a peep. That's why they're staring. That's why it's sinful. What do you think your 17-year-old son does with that thought? You think that happens in a vacuum? Trust me, I was 17 once upon a time. So were you, Chris Ferrara. But that's what they were pining away for. And I went in there and I said, I don't know if you're familiar with Tamika Faki. She was Miss USA 2 years ago. You know what she is not famous for?
What?
She converted from Muslim to Catholic. She's a Catholic.
I know.
Yes. Beautiful girl. I said, if you want a Muslim women's story, well, this is the one right here. If you want Muslim women to have lives where they're not beaten, where they are loved and cherished, specifically because of their femininity and the potential. You know, in philosophy, we always studied potential. All matter, all beings have potential. Their potential to be mothers, and their potential to be part of a real Christian society. Tell them to convert. Conversion, of course, in Muslim countries, that's not possible, because if you convert, you get killed. But it is conversion that we should be wishing for them and praying for them, not so that they can become lesbians, not so they can take the hijab off and put a bikini on, not so that they can abort babies, not so that they can date and be on marriage number 4, not so that they can drive fancy new cars and live in 5,000 square foot houses in America. All the wrong reasons. I'm going like, so you want them to live the tortured, sinful lives that you live?
Well, right. Well, you sent me something yesterday on the problem of Islam in American society. It was an article along the lines of how are we to accommodate the Islamic religion in America's pluralistic regime, given the obvious involvement of Islamism in jihad and related acts of terror. This is a religion that has spread by conquest since it first appeared. It is renewing the conquest today. There's going to be basically a reconquest of Europe by Islam by dint of immigration.
Sure.
And how do we handle this situation in America? The article proposes that perhaps you could treat Islam as in a category by itself, not entitled to First Amendment protection. But then the author in this article explores the problem with that. I mean, Islam clearly is a religion, and the First Amendment clearly does guarantee religious liberty in the modern sense to all religions. So it would seem to include that guarantee Islam as well. And the author then concludes, and this is a fascinating admission on his part. He asks himself in this article, is the First Amendment a suicide pact?
No, is the Constitution a suicide pact?
Yes, is the Constitution a suicide pact? Are we basically, and John Rao, my colleague and friend, has put it this way, does the Constitution constitute something that is destroying us by virtue of this pluralism, and are we becoming, as Dr. Rao says, mindless cheerleaders for the very thing that is destroying us? So at least he raises the question, is it a suicide pact? Now, if you want to talk about the Benedict option, how are you going to talk about the Benedict option without a Saint Benedict? And how are you going to have a Saint Benedict without the Holy Catholic Church? The monks that restored Western civilization, that protected it during the barbarian invasions, that spread it throughout the world, that spread Christendom throughout the Western world and converted an entire civilization, did so not because they were just determined individuals with a lot of gumption. They existed within the church's sacramental system. They were given sanctifying grace through the 7 sacraments. They had all the spiritual helps that only the Catholic Church can provide. The only Benedict option is the Catholic option, because it's the church that gave us Saint Benedict and will give us the new Saint Benedict.
Yeah, but because we can't see this because it was never filmed and we don't have any photographs from it, that means it never happened.
Yeah.
That's just your bigoted and Catholic point of view, and besides, that era is over. It's better now because Americans and everyone else in the Western world, Christopher Ferrara, we get to choose our own path. You see, we get to actually ingest and then meditate upon the Gospels and the Scriptures, and then we can to pick and choose the points of those Gospels and Scriptures that we think are important, and then we get to build and construct a life around those Gospels and Scriptures that we think are important, and therefore, in doing so, we're now Christians. We are now in keeping with the commandments of Christ, and all is right with the world, and that's the end of the discussion.
Well, if you're going to sanctify the social order by sanctifying yourself, you have to begin with the integrity of the truth. If you compromise on one of the truths involved in what we call the law of the gospel, if you say you're walking with Jesus, except on this point or on that point, you've already failed in your mission of sanctification of the individual. I hate to harp on the subject, but it's crucial. Contraception. How can you claim to be a Christian if you're taking a pill or using some sort of method to prevent the conception of immortal souls? You're preventing the existence of souls that have an eternal destiny of felicity with Christ in heaven forever and ever and ever. And you are preventing that through artificial means so you can enjoy life. You've already been defeated by the spirit of the age. So without the integrity of the truth, there's no chance for a restoration of social order. There is no Benedict option for contraceptors. They're not practicing the Benedict option. They're practicing the American option, the customizable Jesus that Howard Bloom referred to, the American Jesus, the Jesus that tells you what you want to hear. It may be that all you want to hear is that you can use contraception, but all these other evils you'll resist, but then you've already fatally compromised. Compromise on one moral principle, and the entire edifice collapses. You may not think so, but you've already agreed in principle to the defeat of the entire Christian program.
Here's another little piece of history that's not convenient to this argument here. England, at the time of its conversion, was filled with either A, Nordic barbarians that wished to kill anyone that wasn't a Nordic barbarian, B, Roman pagans that defended against the Nordic barbarians and thus built Hadrian's Wall, or C, other nomads that had tried that thought that if they escaped to this island that they could escape the other barbarians of Europe because the barbarians wouldn't cross the English Channel or the North Sea, as it were. But none of that. England was a place of absolute chaos for hundreds of years. There were wars, there was savagery, there was cannibalism. You name it. Look. No one in their right mind would want to have lived in England, unless you were a Roman soldier and you were forced to go there, or of course the Nordic savages, barbarians, the Vikings, whatever you want to call them. They went there for conquest. So Christopher J. Ferrara, what changed? Or is it Christopher A. Ferrara? What changed all this? I'll tell you what changed it. Leo the Great sent a man named Augustine. And he told Augustine, not St. Augustine, the other St. Augustine, the great St. Augustine of Canterbury, he told Augustine, you have here are Christ's orders. Go and teach all men of all nations. That island needs to be converted, Augustine. Go do it. You have my blessing. Take your band of apostles or disciples with you or followers, whatever. Go and do it. There's no Canterbury before Augustine goes and establishes. People are, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury? Where do you think Canterbury came from? St. Augustine of Canterbury. Then he established it. The point is, like St. Patrick after him, these barbarians, these pagan hordes, had to be civilized. There is a civilized Europe today because of the church. It's not in spite of it, and that's not an accidental occurrence, which is why I say, as a historian who studied the American Revolution and American history, when I study world history, especially the history of Christendom of Europe, it is impossible. You cannot avoid the ginormous doors of St. Peter's Basilica. I'm sorry, it passes through there. Even if I were agnostic, I would have to admit, well, yeah, okay, yeah, your stupid church had something to do with it. But it was a great thing that now that it's gone or almost gone, and everybody is free to do as they want. Right, Chris Ferrara?
Yes, but, Augustine of Canterbury, were he alive today, would be the first to tell you that it wasn't he that converted the barbarian hordes. He was just the instrument.
Sure.
What underlies the conversion of the Western world? Sanctifying grace, the interior regeneration of the man, elevating him from his fallen state. How does that happen? It happens through baptism and the maintenance of the state of sanctifying grace through the sacraments of the church, particularly Holy Communion and confession. When you fall back into sin, you confess and you're restored to the state of grace. You receive Holy Communion to nourish the soul and maintain that state of grace. All of this revival that we see in that period of history is the result of the operation of sanctifying grace. The interior regeneration, the true regeneration of the individual. He becomes a new man. This is something that Luther wanted to deny because he had a problem with his own personal sins that he seemed unable to overcome. So he wanted to deny that there was a true interior regeneration. He merely said there was an imputed righteousness of Christ and that the sacraments did not produce a new man. But they did, and they do. And the only way to a restoration is through the interior renewal made possible by the sacramental life. Who offers that? Only one institution on the face of the earth offers that. And I'm not talking about the Orthodox schismatics at this point, because they broke away from the church, even if they have valid sacraments. The only institution that offers the sacramental system established by Christ himself for the interior regeneration of man is the Catholic Church. Without the operation of sanctifying grace in the individual's life, there isn't going to be a restoration. It's that simple. We can't do this by human effort alone. Human effort is essential, but it has to be effort assisted by divine grace.
Well, this is the 263rd convening of the Church Ferrara conventions.
Oh, by the way, speaking of the issue with which we began the discussion today, in terms of political renewal, if you look at the text of the Declaration of Independence and you read the recitation of the breaches of compact,
right?
At the end, you read this conclusion, and this is crucial. I mean, I want to jump back to that topic because I think it's a point that should be made. They recite the breaches of compact. I forget the political commentator, but he said if you read the Declaration of Independence, it's a virtual transcript of Locke's political theory. Even the phrase that we see in Locke's second treatise about the long train of abuses appears in the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson had an annotated copy of Locke's two treatises in his library. But at the end, they've recited all the breaches of compact, and here's what they say: that the colonies are, quote, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that, and listen carefully, as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all the other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Full stop. Now, what powers did the former colonies, now states, give to the federal government when they entered into the Constitutional Compact? Why, they gave the federal government the power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, and establish commerce. Hello?
So in the Declaration, the states, not the Union, claim the power.
Yes, but those are the attributes of sovereignty.
Right, but in the Constitution, they then transfer the power.
They transfer them to the central government for the purposes of the Constitutional Compact. That's simply what they did. And so, if you look at the source documents, if you look at the Constitution, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, if you look at the declarations by the southern states, you look at any document you please about concerning these controversies issued at the time the controversies arose, you're going to see them permeated with Lockean contract theory, claims of breach of compact, and you're going to see the entry of these sovereign entities into a new compact in which they surrender elements of their sovereignty to the new governing authority in a new compact. That's just the way this Protestant theory of sovereignty, and it is of Protestant origin, operates. So that's the dilemma in which we find ourselves. We're in a scenario in which we need to establish the proper foundations for political authority, not in the consent of the governed, but in the ultimate source of all authority, which is God himself. You can have a democracy if you please. You can have a federal government consisting of states with a central authority, provided that the organic law of the country recognizes that the ultimate source of that authority is God, and that God's authority limits the exercise of temporal authority. This is what the Hungarians did when they adopted the Christian Constitution in 2012. They acknowledged the Christian roots of Europe. They acknowledged Christ as king of the European enterprise. They recognized that marriage is between a man and a woman. They established in that Constitution a pro-life amendment, rooting all of this in the Christian conception of law, which is that it ultimately rests on divine authority. This is what we need. We don't need another exercise of Lockean compact theory. So if you combine the proper understanding of political sovereignty ultimately rooted in divine authority, with the interior renewal and regeneration of the individual, you have the way back to a restoration. But again, this is going to involve a reconstruction of the alliance between church and state. It's not going to happen, apparently, unless we have a catastrophe.
Well, and then you say reconstructing the alliance between church and state. Most people are just going to recoil in horror. That's not going to happen. You're not going to have a theocracy here, pal.
Like 250 years of propaganda on the part of the very state that oppresses them.
Well, and they all want relief from the state that oppresses them, but they don't want relief from the state that also separated the authority of the church and state and elevated the state to the power above it. That's why
they don't really want to leave.
No.
They're perfectly content with the way things are.
They are.
They get their government benefits, Social Security. They get their amusements. People are comfortable enough now that there's no serious movement to overthrow this regime. People are basically content with the status quo. Now, the Trump's election represented what I talked about before on this show, an inching back from the abyss. Let's see what happens now. I'm not as hopeful as I was a month ago.
844-527-8723. Just checked the donations, bids, auctions, and various statistics at barbacoabrotherhood.com, and am sad to report that there is
0.0.
since my last plea for help. So I got that going for me today, but I press on. Now, Chris Ferrara, before you leave here today, one of the side effects of you appearing here on this show, of course, is Mike being listed or being said to be too Catholic for satellite radio. And one of the other side effects currently will be an hour or two, or maybe half a day or so from the time that you go back to writing and doing what you do, and me, I go back to continuing my fundraising activities and all the prep that it takes to pull this event off this coming Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, is someone's going to write to me and is going to be angry. Well, do you and Ferrara have to go on and insult every living Protestant? Do you have to call us knuckleheads or insinuate that we're knuckleheads? Do you have to do this? Do you have to drone on about that? Do you have to be so pious and smug and arrogant and blah, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And most of the time, if I do respond, I will have to say some serious prayers for humility to try and tamp down that. Look, it's not an assault. It's not an attack. It's the opposite. It's an extortion. It is based upon a knowledge that we hope, he and I both hope, and anyone that would dare to do this would also hope, that has led to wisdom of sort, and that is that there is a unity in God. God is unity, the creator of the universe. In the book of Genesis, no one argues how many gods were there. One. There weren't 38,000, there was one. How many prophecies of messiahs? Were they talking about different messiahs? Was Isaiah prophesying about a different messiah? When David says in Psalm 69, Deus in adjutorium meum intende, domine adjuvanda me festina, he leaves the Holy Ghost out, but he gives you two parts of the Holy Trinity there. Is David, and all throughout the Psalms, it's either domine or Deo. To what entity is he referring? He's referring to God the Father and God the Son, and he doesn't even know. He can't possibly know of the Son of our Lord because he's yet to come, but yet he's writing of him. And this happens all throughout. The point is, there is unity in this. Christendom was a unification. It was acknowledgement of one singular supernatural authority that we call God. And it was an acknowledgement of one singular supernatural teaching authority that we call capital T, capital C, the church. If you're not going to admit that, and if you're not going to conform your mind, what is truth, Chris Ferrara? Conformity of the mind to reality. That's the reality. There is no need and no room for your opinion or for revisionist history that you claim to revile anyways. That's the truth. So if you want to get...
It's not a question of being holier than anybody.
No.
We're all sinners.
Yeah,
the
well, I
point
hope
I'm
it
trying
isn't.
to make is precisely because we are all sinners, we have to make use of the means that the church affords us to avoid living sinful lives that are inconsistent with our profession of the gospel. Once again, take the issue of contraception. Even Martin Luther said contraception is a form of sodomy. He condemned it. Every Protestant denomination condemned contraception until the Lambeth Conference in 1930. Then the Anglicans caved in, and just about every Protestant denomination followed suit. This is a relatively recent evidence of the decay of the Protestant religion. The Christian testimony of all denominations on this point, at least, was unanimous until 1930. So anyone who now claims to be insulted because someone suggests that his use of contraception is inconsistent with the gospel is nothing but a hypocrite. I'm sorry. If you want to walk the walk with Jesus, then walk the walk that even Martin Luther said is necessary. Bring life into the world. That's the starting point for this whole civilizational revival that people are talking about, but they're not taking steps to realize in the concrete facts of everyday life. They're refusing to bring lives into the world. Meanwhile, the Muslims are breeding like rabbits, and they're threatening to overrun all of Europe. So it's not a question of church is holier than thou.
I'm not.
Is holier than thou. I'm talking about minimum standards of morality. Minimum. At a minimum. Do what God wants you to do. Be fruitful and multiply. Stop the nonsense about walking with Jesus while you take a pill or use a barrier to keep little souls from coming under the custody of Jesus for all eternity. That's what I'm talking about.
Well,
it's not even a question of being particularly holy. As opposed to following the natural law, for heaven's sake.
You know what? When we talk about holiness, I'll leave you with Church Ferrara Convention 263. Church Ferrara Unsuccessful Convention 263. Maybe one day we'll have a successful convention. Read the stories about the Vendée of France, if you want a window into this from a more modern perspective. Or you could read about the Cristeros, or those Catholics that were tormented by and martyred by the socialist hitmen in Mexico when that revolution was occurring. But because I know the story of the Vendée much better. Talking about peasant farmers. These people were not, you wouldn't view them and go like, oh, those are holy and pious people. But they actually were holy and pious people. They had very, very large families. They were very, very extraordinarily devout and devoted in their faith. They lived in their own little region of France called the Vendée. And all they wanted after the French Revolution and then the abolition of Catholic orders, of religious orders, and of the order that priests and bishops would have to take an oath to obey to renounce their former oath and to put the French Constitution Congress above the Pope and above what they knew was the eternal law, the Vendée refused. Now, these are a simple, I repeat, French people. And a gathering when they were trying to decide whether or not they had a cause just enough to go and fight the Blues, the Blue Republican Army, who was coming to invade them and to slaughter their women, to slaughter people in villages, and to take their priests that had refused the oath, and to do all the other, to burn their fields, etc. When they had this meeting to discuss, I can't remember it might have been in Avignon, I think. They had this meeting in Avignon to discuss whether or not they should field their own army and take on the Blues. Before the meeting began, thousands of the Vendée, again, remember, these are illiterate peasants for the most part. These are farmers. Thousands of them gathered outside that church in Avignon and at the request of the priest there, all together recited a Te Deum in Latin. Now, if you've ever read the Te Deum in Latin, you would be amazed at what I just said, because it's what, 60, 70 verses long? It's not an easy prayer. They could recite, this is how they knew the point is, they knew the faith, and they lived it as best they could as peasants.
Amenities and features. Find the apartment that's right for you. With what?
Sorry about that.
All right. So if you want an example of what that piety might actually look like, you can find it among the peasant farmers in the Vendée. And by the by, history now records that it was the atheist, Catholic-hating socialist of the Republican Blue Army and of the Constitution Congress that sent that army of marauding soldiers into the Vendée and who massacred between 200,000 and 250,000 men, women, and children. Killed them, slaughtered them. First recorded genocide happened in the absence of the Catholic faith, and happened in the absence or of a war against, not any Protestant denomination. They went after the Vendée because the Vendée would not. You know what the Vendée said, Chris? Non serviam, pal.
Yep.
We will not serve your secular master. We don't want your constitution. We don't want your order. We have one already. Thank you very much. No. And they were killed for it, weren't they? And that, hey, by the way, that doesn't come from some Catholic history book that I went and searched for until I found the answer that I wanted. That comes from the Oxford History of the French Revolution, written by William P. Doyle. That's where that comes from, that story I just told you.
The mainstream historians are now recognizing the nobility of the Vendéan cause, and they're also recognizing the Vendéan genocide perpetrated by the French Republican government at long last. But the Vendée represent what we're talking about: militant Christians, Christian soldiers. The problem in America is we don't have any soldiers. There aren't enough of us.
We're a bunch of cowards.
Because we haven't followed God's plan. So all I'm saying to people in the audience that might be offended, and I know there are a lot of Protestants who agree with me on this. Some of the more conservative evangelicals understand the evil of contraception. They have very large families. They get the moral aspect of the problem, and it begins with morality. If we're not going to observe at least the natural law, however, we're fatally compromised before we start. You know, we want our cake and we want to eat it too. We want worldly comforts, and all of us are afflicted with that temptation, but we don't want the difficulties involved in the Christian life. But the paradox is, Mike, that if you live according to the gospel plan and you bring lives into the world, the joys are incomparable. Sure, it's difficult. Sure, you have to struggle, but God rewards you for persevering in his grace and trusting in him. I used to tell clients who had financial difficulties, and they had maybe one child or two children, I said, you want to get out of this problem? You don't need to declare bankruptcy. Have a few more children, and God will bestow blessings upon you. Your whole life will turn around. Stop being afraid. Stop being afraid of living according to God's will, and you will see, as Jesus said, that he came to give us life and to give it
abundantly,
so that we will have it more abundantly.
Right. Hey, Chris, as always, thank you for your time. I'm also I'm thinking of whenever you have a question about, I can't do that. I don't have enough money. I can't do that. I don't have enough time. I can't do. If you know in your heart that it is the correct and pious thing to do, then there was a peasant, a very poor Polish girl who took religious orders in the 1920s, and her name was Sister Maria Kowalska. We know her today as Saint Faustina. And Saint Faustina kept a diary of everything that that happened to her during her life under religious orders. Saint Faustina, or Sister Kowalska, gives us that beautiful painting that we have today of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. of when you see that painting of Christ with his right hand extended and his left hand pointing towards his, or his right, or is it right or left, pointing towards his burning heart. His heart is burning of love for you and for me. On the right-hand side, there's a red series of rays, and on the left-hand side is a blue series of rays. What's the caption that Christ told her to put on that painting, Chris Ferrara?
Jesus, King of mercy, I trust in thee.
That's right. King of mercy, I trust in thee. And Sister Kowalska, who was tormented, her sisters, her fellow sisters in the convents tormented her. They set her up for failure and wished that she would fail and that she would quit, but she refused. And instead, she would accept every malady, every reproach that came her way, every censure that was placed upon her head by Mother Superior or anyone else, with those simple words, "I trust in you, Jesus." The English interpretation is, "I trust in you, Jesus," and that because she believed that she was pursuing and fulfilling his wish for her. And the story is, you can get her diary. You can buy it at any decent bookstore that has Catholic books in it. You can get Sister Kowalska's the diary. You want to talk? You want to talk about if you want to feel small, insignificant, and incredibly prideful? Pick up Sister Kowalska's diary and yours, or you probably get it online, and you turn to the middle of it and start reading any day, any day of the week, any incident. It doesn't matter. You'll still get to the same thing, and you'll go like, "My goodness, how do you survive?" You survive those challenges by what Christopher A. Ferrara said. You just surrender. Folks, it's difficult. It's difficult to surrender radio audiences that can number into the millions for radio audiences that now we know number into the, I don't know, thousands, hundreds, whatever they are on any given day. But it's the right thing to do. And I did worry about it. You people used to hear me whine and complain about the numbers. I don't whine and complain about the numbers anymore. I don't worry about it. It is what it is. I'm happy for it. I am whining and complaining about donations, but 2 just came in during the last little interlude there. So thanks for those. All right. So this concludes Church Ferrara Convention 263. We will hope to report, we will pray to report progress and success, and maybe even a conversion story or two at Church Ferrara Convention 264 when it convenes next. I'm glad to hear that you overcame the intestinal flu and that you're feeling well and all that, Chris. And as always, thanks for your time, brother.
Okay, Mike, take care. God bless.
God bless you, too.